Video game music from the 80s and 90s was incredibly catchy. Even today, many of these game music melodies are still stuck in your head. However, it seems like the lo-fi sound of the 8-bit era is what gets the most attention and remains the catchiest. Why is that? Well, first we need some backstory, going all the way back to the earliest games. In Pong, there was no music, just little noises when the ball hit the paddles, the sides, and the negative sounding flourish when you got scored on. In 1980, Pac-Man hit arcades and brought with it all the beeps and boops that became synonymous with video games to this very day. This only had a short musical intro, but is still remembered to this day. The 80s also brought the video game crash and the resurgence with the NES, and this brought a whole new era of game music. 8-bit music is now what most people think of when they think of video game music. But why Nintendo? Other games in the 80s had music, but why is it that the music on the NES is what people really remember? Well, as I'm sure anyone who has played many non-NES games from the 80s can tell you, many games didn't have much music. Atari was the major American force in games in the early 80s, and most Atari games had little themes and lots of sound effects, but were silent for the most part. For example, Gauntlet, Joust, and Pitfall all had strong sound effects, but were silent when nothing was happening on the screen. So what caused this emergence of music? In a word, Japan. Japan loves music. Today, Japan is the second largest music market in the world, a very close second to the United States. This is really incredible when you consider that the US population is almost 150% bigger than Japan's population, but the music industry is only 1.35% bigger. This love of music goes back to their history, but I'm not an expert on Japanese culture by any stretch of the imagination, so I would butcher any attempts to try to explain it. However, one thing that is very apparent is that the Japanese love music and love melodies in the background of everything. So it makes sense that this idea that music should go with everything carried over to video games. Most of the biggest games in the 70s and early 80s with almost no music, like the ones I mentioned earlier, are American. This comes mainly from the limitations in technology, meaning music had to be left out, and once technology allowed for more music, the precedent of little music remained. Another important aspect of Japanese music in relation to video games is its simplicity. Japanese music primarily uses the pentatonic scale, which goes as such. The minor pentatonic is the basis of the blues scale, with an added note, a raised fourth or lowered fifth. And the blues scale is the basis for the blues, obviously. This makes it the basis of much of jazz, R&B, and soul, which then led to rock and roll and country, which then led to literally every other pop music genre. Pentatonic scales are part of what makes pop music catchy, since it forces you to be simple. As the name would imply, the pentatonic scale is 5 notes, so any melody built on these notes has to be simple, and people remember simple melodies. This Japanese simplicity translated extremely well to video games, since the hardware was only capable of creating crude waves and very few at a time. The NES could only play 3 separate notes at a time, with a 4th track for white noise, usually used for percussion, and a 5th for short samples, also used for percussion and sometimes bass lines. All this combined to a perfect storm of simplicity, and this simplicity is what gets stuck in your head. Many modern indie titles have sought to pay homage to the 8-bit games of the past, both in overall design and in sound design. The music for many of these games is simple, and some even replicate the 8-bit style, also known as chiptune. And of course, virtually every other piece of music has a chiptune version. I personally have contributed to this genre. So next time you hear an old game soundtrack or a modern song in the chiptune style, remember that simplicity compounded with simplicity creates music that will always be remembered. Until next week, listen well.